I think we're up.
There we go. We're live. All right, guys. So, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Anabolic. This is going to be our Snackem special here. So, we've got a shorter episode here for you. Today, we're going to be covering progressive overload. So, Brady, would you like to open up with what progressive overload is?
Absolutely. Yeah. So progressive overload, very, very simply put, is continuing to add load to whatever mechanism um, you are using to create hypertrophy um, for the same amount of reps than you were doing previously. So, for example, let's take the squat. At one point, you squatted 135 for 6. Then the next week, you squat 140 for 6. That is progressive overload. So
So,
that's very simply put.
cool. Do you
Um,
think progressive? Do you think progressively overload needs to happen like day to day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year?
yeah, so I think most or all very good programs, um, the whole strategy behind them is progressive overload. The goal is to continue to get stronger. Um, and by getting stronger, you are building muscle. You're forcing or the need or adaptation to perform the way you are performing, and the way to do that is um, you load up the bar, you perform, you create a stimulus, an adaptation occurs so that you can perform that, and then you add more load, which then you create a stimulus, which then your body adapts so that you can perform that, and so on, and you keep going. And I think progressive overload really is the driver behind hypertrophy, or is a very important driver behind hypertrophy. Um, so, yeah, I think it's one of the most important training aspects,
Yeah.
is just continuing to add load to the bar
Mm.
or
Yeah,
whatever
I
you're using, right?
yeah, for sure. I definitely say that the name of the game is definitely progressive overload. Like if you're in the gym, whether and you've been in the gym, you've been training for a little bit, regardless of whether or not you have known this, you've been in this attempt to progressively overload yourself. Unless you're that special circumstance where you've just gone into the gym with the objective of lifting the same weight, the same amount of reps every single time. But I think you're probably one of those people who challenges themselves just a little bit more than the next person, hopefully, especially if you're listening to this. You're looking for an extra rep, you're looking for a little bit more weight on the bar. Um, what forms do you think progressive overload takes? Is it just in the form of more load on the bar? Do you see form progression as a form of overload? What do you think, Brady?
Um, so there's a couple different ways you can progressively overload. Obviously, first and foremost is going to be the overload, which so your weight, adding more weight to the bar, grabbing heavier dumbbells, putting the next stack on the machine, whatever. That's probably going to be your first one that most people know and understand well. The second one is that people probably understand next best is going to be rep progression. So continuing to do the same weight, but performing more reps of it. That is another way to overload. It doesn't have the same runway as the actual load does. So there will be a point where you cannot just continue to get another rep to achieve a stimulus for the muscle you are trying to work. Other factors come into play. After that, I wouldn't say form necessarily is a form of progressive overload, um, just because really you should be standardizing from the start. So your form really shouldn't change. And I also wouldn't consider tempo as a form of progressive overload because there is diminishing returns
Mm-hmm.
with tempo. You can sit in the stretched position for 2 seconds, and then I guess if you can sit in the stretch position for 3 seconds, you're technically overloading the stretch position by sitting there longer. However, you're not going to sit in a stretch position for 10 minutes.
Yeah, I
with
think
the
that's just a mix
bar
up
in your
of
hand, right?
words.
So I wouldn't really consider that at least a viable option for progressive overload. I suppose on a very, very small scale, it's a technique you could use,
Mm-hmm.
but really that's a complete other topic that we'll probably talk about in one of these. I think tempo is more of a teaching tool than a progressive tool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, those are probably, I tend to stick to the two main methods of weight and reps. I'm sure there's other ones out there that people have thought of. There is sets. Sets is a method of progressive overload. Um, continuing to add sets, but again, that's another one that there's only so much runway with it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be really, really careful with that because you can kind of dig yourself into a hole if you just keep trying to add sets. That's why, people try German volume training, right? 10 sets of 10, but generally it doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
So it's a method of progressive overload, but it doesn't have as much runway to it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's any other ones that I missed?
Um, no, I just wanted to maybe touch on that runway position because when you're progressively overloading, you want to make sure that you have as much runway as possible. Like you want to make sure that
Yep.
you can progress with as within as much time as you possibly can. So like if you did just start with German volume training, you will have progressively overloaded yourself to start managing and dealing with 10 sets of 10. And then eventually you will have adapted to that. And then you've essentially just decreased the amount of runway that you have because what are you going to do? Add
Yeah.
another set onto the 10 sets that you've already done?
Yeah.
Probably not. It's much better to chill with the 2 to 3, maybe 4 really intense sets and really like and just kind of milk those and ride them.
Yeah. So when you're setting up your program with progressive overload in mind, you obviously want to have the base of it around something that gives you the most room to progress,
Hmm.
and that's going to be load,
Yeah.
right? Um, so, there is a very, 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 very large amount of space on a barbell. Um, you know, Dumbbells are limited to a certain extent, but you can go pretty far with dumbbells. Machines only go so far, and so on. So, that's kind of why you program around barbells because they have the furthest progressive runway, and you can progressively overload them the most. After that, you start working with rep schemes. So that's your next step down. A lot of times, a program has more than one progressive overload method within it, right? So you're not just progressing load, but then within that set that you're progressing load, you're also trying to progress reps. There is a pretty good runway with reps.
Hmm.
Not as big as load, but it's the next step down. So that is also into your program. Um, After that, you then can start to progressively overload sets if you're getting to a point where the other two are having diminishing returns. And you work that way,
Hmm.
basically. So you want to start with your biggest bang for buck, which is going to be your load, and then implement the other strategies next to it
Yeah.
to kind of fill out a program.
Yeah. And if you are getting those diminishing returns, you might be experiencing a little bit of just fatigue, and maybe it's time for a deload
Right. Yeah, yeah,
of some sort.
absolutely. So,
Yeah.
unless you have fully maxed out the barbell, um, then there's always room to go, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So, how do you go about progressively overloading your movements, Brady?
I had weight.
How much weight?
Uh, it
Plate,
totally depends.
2 plates?
It's very, very dependent on the movement, how comfortable I am with the movement. So I can't give a set amount that I increase, but um, to explain just how simple progressive overload is, literally half a pound more than what you did last time is progressive overload.
Mm.
Any amount more than what you did last time is progressive overload. It doesn't matter how big or small it is.
Yeah.
You could throw on 2 plates from last time, and that's progressive overload. You could throw on half a pound from last time, and that's progressive overload. And where you are at in your journey and your lifting age and all of these things will probably determine which one of those steps you take.
Yeah.
You know?
I think time also is another thing as well, because like if you're progressively overloading across a year or two or three or four, that is a good amount of time to have, really get the ball rolling to get some good momentum behind you. But if you've only like let's say intra week, you're talking, right? And you
Yeah.
go from um 225 on bench for 10, but then the next week you decide to dirty your sets up like a shit ton, right? And you busted five just on that one set. You're like, yeah, like I just did five. Like technically, that's not progressive overload just because you did that. Everything
Yeah.
does. You have to keep the standardization in mind too. Like everything has to be standardized
Yeah.
within your sets. Your reps have to be standardized. So you can't just expect to like walk in dirty shit up and then be like 5 pound, 5 reps up and be like, yeah, I just progressed. Or
Right.
like a 1 RM is like the best example. It's like someone, the dudes that like one or the dudes and gals that 1 RM like every other week. It's like they think that they're progressing, but that's not actual progression. It's
Right.
like you have to look at it a little bit more wide lens approach.
Yeah. I agree. Um yeah, so you know, progressive overload most times is not a very quick process. Um, it takes some time, and generally it's in small increments, especially if you've been training for a while. But as Brandon said, the key to actually progressively overloading is having standardization amongst your reps, making sure that week to week your sets look the same, your reps look the same, and the easiest way to visualize it is let's talk about a dumbbell curl. So you walk in the gym and you do 10 perfect dumbbell curls with 20 pounds.
Super strict.
Yep. And then a year down the road, you do 10 perfect dumbbell curls with a 40-pound dumbbell. Now you progressively overloaded to get there. You kept the same perfect strict reps. And if that happens, you can pretty much guarantee that you grew bigger arms,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you can lift a bigger weight for the same reps with the same exact technique, style, everything, if everything is held the same and the only variable that changed is the weight of what you're moving, then you can be assured that you made progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that is the key behind progressive overload is keeping every single other variable in check.
Yeah. Versus week one, you strict curl it 30 pounds for 10, it was. And then week
I think it's
two,
20 pounds.
oh, 20 pounds. Sorry, I thought you were a beast, Brady. And then versus the next week, and then you do 40 pounds for 10, but you just dirtied things up. You like heaved it. That is not progressive overload. That's just things on the opposite side of the spectrum for you. Oh, Brady is getting like supernovaed right now. Super exposed. Um, so yeah, why bother progressive overloading, Brady? We kind of touched on it. I think it's like the slow road does kind of suck just a little bit because you have to bite the bullet and you got to take your time and do things the right way. But it's much more rewarding when you get to the end of the line, so to speak, when you can actually progressively overload things properly instead of just kind of walking in there, blasting away at a weight, going in there the next week and blasting it away at a different weight and kind of just saying, I think I'm doing well. Oh, you are muted.
So why progressive overload?
Yes. So why choose progressive overload over just walking in there?
Um, because when done right, it guarantees success over the long term. You know, it is the only method of training that will guarantee a continued stimulus for hypertrophy. It it's just how it is. So you can't expect to bench 135 for 6 and have that create a stimulus, and then you just keep benching 135 for 6 and expect it to keep creating a stimulus. It won't.
Mm-hmm.
You your body will adapt from that stimulus, and then it will no longer need to adapt because it can handle it. You have to add load. That's just like that's the basics of it. That there's really no other way around it. You have to continue to progress. And so yeah, it's for people that don't care about their gains, um, or actually making progress. You can go in the gym and rip whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but for anybody that's actually trying to continue a long journey of growth, progressive overload is what's going to take you from point A to point Z.
Yeah. So you guys have heard us talk about this probably every episode almost.
Probably.
So to suggest a little something for you guys, it would be to pick a rep range, a lower rep range and a higher rep range. You can choose a 6 to 8 and then a 12 to 15. And then pick a load and, pick a load for your 6 to 8. So something a little bit heavier. And then just do it. See what you get. If you get 6 reps, you'll be at the bottom of that rep range and you'll know that that load is heavy enough for that set because you will have failed at that 6 rep. Um, and then on the next week, you can try and catch 7. If, let's say, you try to do that 6 to 8 and the load was, and then you hit maybe 10 reps, you'll know that that load was a little bit too light, and you'll have to increase. So, and then after that top set, you'll just back off and then you'll do a 12 to 15 and you'll pretty much replicate exactly what you did with your 6 to 8 with your 12 to 15. You'll pick a weight, you'll shoot for 12 to 15. And then let's say you hit your 12 and you fail at that on the 13th and you only get 12, then that weight was bueno and you can rock it the following week and try to snag another rep. And that is honestly the best way we can honestly probably suggest progression to you. And then when you have pushed those rep ranges to their upper limits, so that 6 repper becomes an 8 repper, then you can increase load.
Yep.
And when it comes to load increases, that you're going to have different load increases, probably most likely differences between your upper body and your lower body. You're probably only going to be able to load or progress the upper body by anywhere between like maybe 5 and 10 pounds increments at a time, whether that's on both sides or just one. Depends on really who you are and how strong you are and how used to the movement you are as well. Um,
Yeah, it's
and then
gonna
your
vary
lower
for
body can
everybody.
and then your lower body will generally handle a little bit more, and you can probably progress by a little bit more, maybe 5, 10, 15.
Yeah. So a really key part that I'm just gonna touch on briefly here, it should be its own episode, is he said fail, right? You don't stop in your rep range. You're supposed to fail in your rep range. They're very
Yes.
different things. You go into a set and the concept is you're gonna do as many as it takes to fail. Not I'm gonna do 6,
Yeah.
right? You, you're going to failure, and really the concept is that you picked a load that you fail within 6 to 8 reps,
Mhm.
not I'm doing 6 to 8 reps. Here's a load I put on the bar.
Yeah, like I'm not gonna give Brady like 10-pound dumbbells and be like, all right, bench this between 6 to 8, for a 6 to 8.
Yeah, do it 6 or 8 times and then set it down.
Yeah.
No, the key behind progressive overload and hypertrophy is failure,
Hmm.
right? That's creating the stimulus. And again, that's a whole other episode to chat about, and we aren't going to dive into that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That will be a
So
fun
let's
Snackem though.
that will be a fun one. Keep a lookout for that one. Um, so we've kind of covered a lot of this,
Hmm.
um, but when do we progressively overload?
Um, yeah. Week, day in and day out. week by week, we're progressively overloading every single session. Like you probably heard Brady or I talk about this. Like every session that we have, one of the lifts within that workout will have been a rep up, most likely.
Yep.
There hasn't been a single
The goal
day.
is always to improve.
Yeah, exactly. Like there
Yep.
really hasn't been a single day that every single day I would say that I have either broken even or been a rep up. Some days I will say maybe there's like one or two crappy days out there where I was maybe a rep down. Like, dude, I literally like those RDLs that we had talked about.
Right.
Horrible day. Happens. But usually more often than not, we're always a wrap up on something in the day.
Yep.
You know, we always have some sort of win or we've broken even.
Right.
And I feel like
So
that's not something that a lot of people get when they normally lift.
yeah, I think it's because a lot of people don't track their stuff.
Yeah, they also don't know if they've like PR'd. That's the other thing.
Right. So again, another conversation.
Yeah.
But is there any exercises we shouldn't progressively overload? No.
Couch sitting. If that is an exercise, don't do that.
Yeah, so basically, um, if if there's any muscles you don't want to grow, then that's when you don't progressively overload.
Yeah, that's
Which,
actually a good circum. That
can
actually
kind of
does
bring
happen.
up the topic. Yeah, it can bring up the topic of, say, you're way unbalanced and your legs are way too big for your upper body.
Mhm.
Probably stop progressively overloading, keep them where they're at. So that's when you kind of keep the same weight, same reps, that kind of stuff, and you're just kind of holding a maintenance there while you're letting your upper body catch up to you. But that's a very, those are individual cases.
Yeah.
There's pretty much, for most people, there's almost no time where you shouldn't be trying to progressively overload.
Yeah, like that circumstance that Brady just talked about, you're probably not in that box.
You're
Neither are
probably
we.
not even listening to this. So yeah, that you should attempt to progressively overload everything you do, depending on the exercises. How quickly you can overload is going to look different. You are not going to be able to progress in a bicep curl at the same speed you're going to be able to progress a squat or a deadlift. It's just it won't happen. They're much smaller muscles. They take longer time to adapt and grow to meet that next requirement. So it looks different muscle to muscle, but you should always be trying to move forward and create the new stimulus. That's really all we train for. You know, if you're listening to this as a bodybuilder, we train to create a stimulus, to create an adaptation that grows muscle.
Yes.
You know, that's it. Really, the load doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. If I could bench 135 pounds and have a huge chest and squat
Everyone would be
135
walking
pounds,
around like this.
right? If that was possible, rock on. Like that would be so cool. But that's not how it works. You know, we train for a stimulus. So that's why you have to progressively overload.
And I also think it does a good amount. It does a good job of reducing injuries too, or at least kind of like mitigating the risk of injuries. Because usually what happens is people just kind of go for shit. You know, they just slap on a bunch of
Yeah.
weight, or they don't really have that standard for the quality of their movement, and they just decide to dirty things up, and then they get hurt. You know, so progressively overloading, taking your time, adding 2.5, 10 pounds at a time, does a really good job of kind of keeping you tidy, the
Yeah.
rep ranges
Keeps you
where
in
they
check.
need to be. Yeah, exactly. It keeps you in check. And you'll know when you deserve a higher load because you will have shown your proficiency with the loads that you're working with right now. If you can turn 225 from a 6 repper into an 8 repper, or let's say that you decide to go a little bit further, you want to build a little bit more proficiency with it, you want to make it into like an 8 or a 9, then now you've really proven to yourself, okay, now I know I can handle like 235, 245.
Yep. Yep. It's laying breadcrumbs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a path, right? That's going to walk you through your journey of getting massive.
Yes. Yeah. Brick by
Um,
brick.
yep.
Like you want to make sure that you're laying those bricks down. Like every single brick that you lay down for your house should be perfect, like perfectly set in stone. Because like by the end of it, once you've built your house, you want to make sure that would you rather every brick be in line, or would you rather you have just, you just kind of speed, like you just like speed tested it and you just like lay down the brick like it's like sideways, upside down, the mortar's like halfway in and halfway out. It's like you can't, like what kind of a house do you
Funky
want to build for
house.
yourself? Yeah, exactly. So like remember, you're building this house for yourself, so like
Yeah.
you want to live in a nice house or
Yep.
a crap house.
Yep. But I think that's it for progressive overload.
I think so too.
Yeah, if you guys enjoyed the video, give us a like, thumbs up. Put on notifications. We are putting out more content now with our general weekly anabolic 2 hour long podcast, but then we're also getting these shorter episodes out. So make sure you're kind of keeping an eye on the channel and hit that subscribe button if you haven't. You can get it down in the bottom right hand corner. It'll pop up here in just a second. All right, everybody. We'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.
Peace.